Hello, it's David Leroy here, and this lecture presentation is on false, recovered, and repressed memories. So I'd just like to begin before talking about recovered and repressed memories by reminding ourselves of a couple of well-established principles of memory. And so those are forgetting and remembering. And forgetting was first studied by a psychologist called Hermann Ebbinghaus in 1885. He published a book called Memory, and in this book he details a number of studies that he conducted on himself, looking at how memory changes over time, and he gave to psychology the idea of the negative exponential forgetting function. And the legacy of that type of research on forgetting is that it is very well established that over time memories fade and that more forgetting occurs early on in the memory process and then levels out, and that's the negative exponential element to forgetting. And also there's been well-established principles of memory around remembering. And we've known for a very long time, beginning with the work of Bartlett in 1932, that memory is a reconstructive process. It's put together, and memory is very much not a video recording of our experiences, but rather something that is forgetful. And when we want to remember things, we've got to reconstruct our memories. Now, the concept of repression has also entered the discussion about memory from a psychological perspective. So, repression, what's the definition of a repressed memory? Well, that's memory that is not accessible unless it has been recovered. So, retrieval cues won't work until the particular memory has been recovered. And that's because the original memory is somehow being repressed. So that would be a situation, for example, where someone may have gone to a football match, witnessed a tragedy, and then to protect themselves from the effects of witnessing the tragedy, the memory could be then repressed. And what makes that a repressed memory is that throughout life, if people start talking about football games and so forth, what about this, that, and the next thing, that person would not be able to remember the traumatic experience that they may have seen when they went to the football game. That is until it has been recovered. And this is seen as a defense mechanism. So this is a way of the mind protecting us from memories that could be overwhelming. The recovery process can happen many, many years later. And when that memory comes back to mind, it's believed that that will help people explain their current situations. It'll allow them to heal, and it will allow them to progress on with their lives without that traumatic event affecting them in their subconscious. So the idea of repression is most commonly discussed in terms of the debate around historical child abuse. So that's a few comments about the idea of repression. What's the legal position? Well, over the years, growing numbers of individuals have come forward to authorities claiming that they have repressed and recovered memories of historical abuse. And this has led in many countries, in particular the United Kingdom and the United States, to change their laws. And so the laws were changed in the way that they allowed delayed reporting of abuse, and that those delayed reports of abuse are indeed admissible into the court, and that they have no statute of limitations. So this has led to increases in numbers of cases going to court and also increases in the number of convictions. And that's an important thing to bear in mind and consider. So people over the previous decades have gone to court claiming that they have recovered memories of abuse, and the person they accuse has sometimes been found guilty and required to then serve prison sentences. Now, the idea of repression amongst psychologists has led to widespread concern about the accuracy of these memories. And from a psychological perspective, there are some really important questions that should be asked. These might seem like simple questions, but they are indeed important ones. So, is it a fact that human beings can repress their memories? Is it possible to recover previously repressed memory? And how reliable are those memories? Are they going to be accurate memories or inaccurate ones? And is it possible that sometimes when people come forward with memories that are recovered, is it possible that sometimes those memories could be completely false? Now, the only way to investigate that is to put these ideas underneath the experimental spotlight. And investigations into false memory, recovered memory, and so forth have led to an incredible amount of controversy and debate within the field of psychology and society more generally. And this debate is referred to as the false memory debate, and amongst psychologists we refer to that period of time as the memory war. So the false memory debate ended up being very emotionally charged. People had a lot of deeply held views and beliefs about how memory works and what we should be doing in terms of our professional response to historic and delayed claims of child abuse. And there are lots of implications of how we understand recovered and repressed memories. They have implications for individuals, social implications, and political implications for how the law operates more generally. So the debate centers around, the conditions in which these memories are recovered. So exactly what is happening to people around the time that they recover these previously repressed memories. The debate also wants to consider the power of suggestion. Could that be involved? And the types of professionals who are engaged in searching for recovered and repressed memories. Now, the debate tended to polarize people from different professional backgrounds. This is an oversimplification, but if you want to imagine a clinical position versus a psychological position. So from a clinical position where you would be wanting to help people who are having problems, you might be interested in the reproductive nature of memory. You would come from a perspective where when people tell you things that have happened to them, they're exactly what happened. And so helping people recover those memories is obviously going to allow them to be on a pathway to heal themselves. A psychological position is that memories are reconstructive and that they are prone to errors. And if you think back to the well-established psychological principles of memory around forgetting and remembering, that would lead us to think that this would be a pretty important concern if memory is prone to error. And the psychological position also emphasizes that there is a chance that when we do see recovered memories, they're actually a product or an artifact of therapeutic processes that individuals become involved in. So just a few words about the history behind false memory debate. The finger is normally pointed by people at Sigmund Freud, who wrote a lot about psychoanalysis. The position that Freud took was that repressed memories of trauma um, helped explain the present day dysfunction that he saw in many of his patients. So if people were coming to see the psychologist, maybe they have some sort of hysteria or anxiety, Freud would think, well, to understand how to treat that and alleviate those problems, we need to find the root cause. What is the thing that's happened to this person that has caused them their present day dysfunction? Freud also believed that the types of things that cause present day dysfunction originated in traumas like child abuse that occurred at an early age. Now, Freud probably had some very strong ideas about how to deal with people who had some sort of psychological dysfunction, and we can see this in his writing. Here's a quote from one of his books. Once certain of a correct diagnosis, we are in a position to translate the symptomology into etiology, and may then boldly demand confirmation of our suspicions from the patient. We must not be led astray by initial denials. If we keep firmly to what we have inferred, we shall in the end conquer every resistance by emphasizing the unshakable nature of our convictions. So this is Freud writing that when you have a patient that has some type of dysfunction, it really has to be something underlying that dysfunction that should be uncovered. And if you make that suggestion to the patient that you're seeing and they say no, you shouldn't be put off by that. You need to keep inferring that, that is the reason or the explanation for their dysfunction at the moment. Freud also believed that whatever techniques that he wanted to use with his patients, that they would not be influenced, right? That it's okay to be suggestive and forceful in the therapy sessions because that's not going to influence the memories of the patient. So he believed that pressure was justified and it was in the best interests of the patient to impose this idea onto them. And so, according to Freud, it was really important to overcome the reluctance if his treatments were to go on to be successful. Lindsay and Reed in 1994 wrote that, even to that day, many modern day therapeutic treatments rely on recovered memory therapy, where the primary goal is to uncover repressed, disassociated, or otherwise unavailable memories of trauma in order to resolve present-day psychological ailments. I think probably as a side issue, we might be interested in seeing whether that still holds true today. So that statement was written in 1994, and it certainly was true that many practitioners were using recovered memory therapy, but over time things change and take on different forms. So it would be really interesting to, in another slide presentation, look at how things have evolved over the previous decades. So what's this sequence of events that people go through when they're seeking help? So let's say you suffer from anxiety, depression, and you might think, well, this is affecting my life. I need to go and see someone who might be able to help me. You go to a therapist. You talk to a therapist about some of your problems, and then after a certain period of time, the therapist might pause and say something along the lines of, in my experience, a lot of people who are struggling with many of the same problems you have had some kind of really painful things happen to them as kids. Maybe they were beaten or molested. I wonder if anything like that has happened to you. Now, initially, patients would deny anything had ever happened. They don't have a memory for that. A therapist might then direct the patient to a book called The Courage to Heal. And this was first published by Bass and Davis in 1988. And this is a self-help book for survivors of sexual abuse. And there's lots of helpful information in the book, and there are also some statements about, memory. And here are a couple of quotes. If you have a feeling that something abusive happened to you, it probably did. Many women don't have memories. This doesn't mean that they weren't abused. And the therapist asks the clients to consider the possibility that they might have been abused, to read the book and then come back to another therapy session where issues around repressed memories would then be explored in more detail. And the goal of going through this type of therapy then becomes one of uncovering a repressed memory, bringing that into consciousness. So there's a couple of different goals here, and I come from a forensic psych background, and I'm interested in issues around memory and how they relate to investigative interviews. And when people are investigating crimes, it's important that we investigate those crimes thoroughly. And during those investigations, we would want potential witnesses to be telling us facts, things that they really can remember. And also, when we're extracting information from witnesses and victims, we want to do that in a very controlled way and make sure that we're not doing anything that is suggestible or leading. We want to make sure that we're not doing anything that could influence the testimony someone's providing. Now, by contrast, therapists are trying to diagnose the symptoms. So what they are doing in their professional work is taking information that is provided by their patients at face value and then encouraging those people to elaborate, and in that way the therapist gets an idea about what's happening in the life of that person. But it's not important for the therapist to investigate the truth of anything that is being said to them. They can take that pretty much at face value. So what's some techniques that therapists have used over the years to get to these repressed memories? Well, there are things like imagery work. So you might sit down in a session, just tell the person to build an image of something that might have happened in the past, tell a story about it, and then try and develop the story and build more images. Dream work. Some therapists have believed that dreams are a channel into our unconsciousness and that they can give us information. They need to be interpreted. Dreams can be quite fragmentary and have strange themes in them, but some therapists will, explore what's happening during dreams and then try and see whether there is evidence that the content of those dreams is really symbolic of psychological or physical abuse that occurred earlier in their lives. Hypnotic age regression. So this is also believed to be able to tap into the unconsciousness and tap into repressed memories. There's also group therapies that have been used. So if you have a number of people and you bring them together as a group and you just start asking them to share their stories, they all want to be able to share and develop their stories, and through group work, this can make people see that having recovered and repressed memories is actually normal because everyone else in the group is experiencing those too. And also art therapy. You might ask a client to draw some pictures, and then you might want to interpret them. I've got an example here of a picture that a small boy has drawn, and I would like to see you take a moment to come to your own interpretation as to what's going on. So we have here a little boy whose name is Michael, and you can see him here on the left of the screen. He's got a sad face. He's reaching out to his mother, who has a happy face, and here is a love heart, but it's got a big red X through it. So we've got a sad little boy, a happy mother, and a symbol of an absence of love. So that might cause people to look at a picture like that and think, actually, there's something going on there. Is the child trying to signal that they have at some point in the past been abused? Now, I know the little boy who drew this picture, and I also know the circumstances in which it was drawn. The little boy had asked his mum to set up his PlayStation so he could play games, and she said, I'll do it in a couple of minutes. I've just got to finish doing something in the kitchen. And because it didn't happen straight away, the wee boy left the room, drew this picture, and came back and presented it to his mum and said, I don't love you. Now, a few minutes later, he did have his PlayStation set up, and he drew another picture with happy faces and love hearts and things like that to show that he was now happy. But it's just an example of how careful we need to be when we look at things. Our mind can't help jump to conclusions, but we, as forensic psychologists, always need to be really cautious that we're not coming to conclusions or coming to conclusions about things that are extremely serious when we have overlooked some common and less serious explanations for, in this example, why children draw things the way that they do. So back to this question, is it possible to repress memories? Now, psychologists have written for a long time that there is no reliable evidence that individuals can repress or disassociate memories of traumatic events. There's been decades of research, and there still is no laboratory scientific experiments that are able to show us how repression works or that repression even exists. So it's not been validated, the idea of repression. And so, because there's minimal evidence for the idea of repressed and recovered memories, there's a really serious possibility that these memories aren't memories at all, and that they are in fact what people refer to as false memories or untrue memories. So if people are coming up with memories and they're saying that they've recovered them and that this happened in therapy, how is that possible that people would come up with completely false stories or come to believe that they have been abused in the past and then form memories of that abuse happening? So could it be the case that when people are going to therapy sessions, the therapist either deliberately or inadvertently planted a false memory? How could that happen? So from a psychological perspective, we need to think about what research methods, what paradigms we're going to use to explore these issues, whether the methods that we're going to use are valid, whether we're able to find evidence of false memory and how widespread this is. What's the prevalence of false memory? Is it something that might only happen to 1 in 1,000 people, or is it something that is relatively common to all of our memories? So I want to talk to you now about this study called Lost in the Mall, and this was conducted by Loftus and Pickrell in 1995. And what they did is they took a sample of 24 participants, and the participants had siblings, and they would participate together in the study, and one sibling would read a passage like this to the other and then ask about what they could remember. So this is an attempt by the researchers to implant a false memory. The memory they're going to try and implant is that sometime in their childhood this person had been lost in a shopping mall. So they're asked, I remember that once you and I were at the shopping centre with Mum. You must have been about 5 or 6 because I was about a different age. I was looking in the store window and standing next to Mum. When we turned around, you were gone. Mum yelled out your name, and lots of people turned around to see what was going on. I don't remember ever being so scared. You must have been really scared too, because when we found you, you were standing in the corner crying. Mum was so relieved that she went and bought us some of our favourite childhood treats. This is what I remember about the event. Now, what do you remember about the event? Now, the participants might initially say, actually, you know what, I can't remember that. But they repeated that in a number of different sessions. So in this study, they came back 3 times, and they were asked each time to remember about when they were lost in the shopping mall. Now, they were also asked true events, and you can see that the participants generally had in each of those sessions good memories for the true events. None of them recalled being lost in the shopping mall in the first session, but over time that number grew to about a quarter of participants then falsely claiming that they had been lost in a shopping mall when they hadn't been. And so that looks like good evidence that people can form false memories. They had no memory of being lost in a shopping mall because the researchers has established that that hadn't happened to them. And then just simply having someone asking them whether that happened or not on a few different occasions caused them to form a false memory of them being lost in a shopping mall when they were a child. So is it the case that the results of studies like this generalize well to cases of child sexual abuse? I think that's a really important question for you to consider. Other people have looked at the study and said, well, being lost in the shopping mall is pretty plausible. And so if you were to ask me whether I'd been lost in a shopping mall, I'd probably say yes, because it's just the sort of thing that probably happened to me at some point in my life. It seems very plausible that I've not been looking where my parents are and wandered off into the wrong direction and then realized that I was on my own. So Kathy Pezdek and her colleagues conducted an experiment where they looked at this lost in the shopping mall paradigm again. And when they looked at this again, they came up with the idea that maybe the reason people were agreeing to being lost in the shopping mall was because it is indeed a relatively plausible event that could occur in somebody's childhood. So Kathy Pezdek and her colleagues wanted to look at the issue around plausibility. So they essentially conducted the study again, which is called a replication. But they had a couple of different conditions that the Loftus study didn't have. It had the plausible event, right, which is the replication part, but they also had an implausible event. So not only were participants in the study going to be asked whether they had been lost in a mall, they were also going to be asked whether in their childhood they had received a rectal enema, which is not as common and may seem implausible to people. So in the study, it followed the same form as the Loftus study, but what the participants were told from a sibling was slightly different. It was about summertime and we were out at school. I think it was about 1990 something because something else happened. It was really fun because we got to stay up late and eat whatever we wanted. I remember we ate lots of our favourite food. A couple of days of junk food though, you started to feel really sick and were nauseous and uncomfortable. Mum thought you should have an enema. I remember her telling you that the enema wouldn't hurt and that it would make you feel better. You were scared anyway though, because when she took you into the bathroom, I remember you cried a lot. That is what I remember about this event. Now, what do you remember? And so the child, in the same way, the participant in the study, just in the same way as the Lost in the Mall study, would have come back for a few different sessions, maybe initially not having any memory for it, but then the researchers wanted to see if a false memory would have formed around this rectal enema in the same way that it did for the Lost in the Mall scenario. So what they did is they sort of replicated the Loftus finding. So they did find that, a percentage of people came to recall being lost in the shopping mall. But even over 3 sessions, the participants, when they were questioned about the implausible event, none of them formed a false memory to that or agreed that that had indeed happened. So that tells us something about the interaction, of how we interrogate our mind and the plausibility that we're going to think things happened to us that really didn't. I want to talk to you about another study now that tackles the idea of imagination inflation. So this is the idea that simply thinking about things is going to cause us to produce memories for false events. In this study, 20 participants were interviewed 3 times over a 2-week period. The researchers had obtained photos from the family of the participants, childhood photos, and during the sessions, the researchers put the photos on the table so the participants could see them, and then they were asked about what they could remember. And now most of the photos that the participants were shown were photos of true childhood events, and so the participants got to talk about those. But what the researchers had also done is they'd doctored one photo using image manipulation software. So here's an example of how that might have happened. This is a childhood photo of a father and son, and part of this image would have been cut and then pasted into this image, which is depicting the father and son inside of a hot air balloon. And then that was slid across the table too. Participants were asked if they could remember anything about the hot air balloon ride. And what was really interesting about this study is that a very high percentage of people started to form childhood memories of being in a hot air balloon ride when they couldn't have been in a hot air balloon ride. And what does that actually look like? Well, we're lucky because these researchers have put some of the actual narrative from the study into their research articles so we can see for ourselves what's happened. So you can see here when interviewers were first questioning their participants, asking them to tell them as much as they can. They're saying, no, I actually thought I'd been in a hot air balloon. Can't you remember anything? No memory whatsoever. If you want to take the next few minutes and concentrate on getting the memory back or something about the event, and then the participant might have tried that. Honestly, no, I can't. That's really annoying. So they've left that therapy session being, study session, having been asked about a hot air balloon and then nothing came to mind. Now they've come back for a second session, and then by the third time that they've gone back to see the researchers, they say, same again, tell me everything you can recall about the hot air balloon ride without leaving anything out. And so now the person, having had no memory whatsoever, is coming back and telling the researchers, just trying to work out how old my sister was, trying to get the exact day when it happened, but I'm still pretty certain it occurred when I was in Form 1 at the local school there. Basically for $10 or something you could go up in a hot air balloon, and I got to go up about 20 odd meters. It would have been a Saturday, and I think we then with parents and not my grandmother, not certain who any of the other people are there. I'm pretty certain that Mum was down on the ground taking the photo. And so you can see there that just over the space of a few days and so forth, someone has gone from having no memory of a child hot air balloon ride to now having a narrative with supporting memories. You can see how the memory has been reconstructed. And we know in this study that it has been reconstructed inaccurately. And here are some other studies that have looked at other aspects of false memory. And this is one here by Kronberg. It was published in 1996. What they did is they studied people's memories for a disaster. And this one involved a Boeing 747 that took off from a Dutch airport and crashed into an apartment block, and many people were killed. Now, what the researchers wanted to see was how the memories of people for that tragedy worked. And when the tragedy happened, there would have been lots of news footage and lots of reporters would have been on the scene, and so people all over the world would have been able to look at the aftermath and rescue operation. Now, they invited people to the study along the lines of, think about the time of this tragedy. We've got some questions to ask you about it. And one of the questions was, did you see the television film of the moment the plane hit the apartment building? Now, more than half of the people said that they did see the plane crashing into the building. And what's alarming is that even though people can visualize watching the plane crashing into that building, there was actually never any footage of the actual plane crash. And so that had to be some sort of false memory. And other researchers have looked at this in the context of the Twin Towers tragedy in New York. And when people are asked, can they remember seeing the first plane hitting the Twin Towers, people do have memories for that too, when actually there is only footage of the second plane hitting one of the towers. And so this crashing memory paradigm has been used in other contexts too. They've looked at memory for the car crash that killed Princess Diana. There was lots of media reports, lots of footage of the aftermath of the accident, lots of descriptions about what had happened, how fast people were going, but there was no actual footage of the actual crash. And when people are invited to participate in a study looking at memories for the death of Princess Diana, and they're asked about their memory for seeing the crash, 44% of people claimed that they did indeed see the crash itself. And there are other studies here. There's a ferry disaster that occurred some time ago. There was lots of footage of the rescue, no footage of the actual sinking of the ferry, but many people in the study, when asked, were able to say that they could remember seeing that. And also other studies on the Bali nightclub and the Pim Fortuyn murder have also confirmed these findings, right? That when people are asked for detail about things that they know might have happened, they're able to claim that those are things they really saw, when really they're things that they've been told about. So psychologists over the years have wondered, people who are reporting recovered memories, people who are coming forward with these, are these people who are in some way more suggestible? And what Clancy and colleagues had done is they had conducted a study that used a measure of false memory on people who had previously claimed that they had recovered repressed memories of child sexual abuse. So those people were invited to participate in this study, and they were asked to conduct a number of memory tests that were able to give some measure of false memory. And what the research initially showed was that people who claimed to have recovered and repressed memories were also more likely to show false memory when they had their memories tested. And so it might be that there is some sort of predisposition or susceptibility that people have when it comes to false memory. Now, the study itself, which was a good one, was rightly criticised because it really couldn't be established whether or not these women had been sexually abused in reality. So it didn't prove that false memories didn't exist. It just proved that people who have recovered memories of abuse do worse on those memory tests. And it might be that, having been abused, it might have had profound effects on someone's life that caused some memory impairments. And so we're not really sure whether, the findings are not an artifact of real abuse having occurred and then changing someone's ability to do well on false memory tests. So what the researchers did is they conducted the study again, and they needed to find something that really, really didn't happen, but that also was something that people would claim to have recovered and repressed memories about. And what they chose was memories of alien abduction. So they invited people to participate in the study if they indeed had recovered or repressed memories that they'd been abducted by aliens. Now, the researchers reasoned that alien abduction was completely impossible, and anybody who has a memory or a recovered memory of being abducted by aliens has a false memory of that, right? Because it just cannot be true. So they enlisted participants in this study, and they had 3 groups. So they had a recovered memory group. So these people remembered the alien abduction. No problem. They'd been to maybe therapy. They'd been asked to remember their traumatic experience, and then the memory had been recovered, and they had a full memory of what happened to them when they were with the aliens. They also had a repressed memory group, and so these are people who had no memory of actually being abducted by aliens, but they knew they had been because there were other indicators that convinced them that they'd been taken by aliens. So these people would maybe have unexplained operation scars or suction marks and so forth that they would have no memory for the alien abduction, but they would say, look, this is the result of being tested by the aliens while I was taken. And they also had a control group. So I would have been in the control group. You would ask participants, have you ever been abducted by aliens? And I would say no. And then that would qualify me for being in the control group. Now, I talked a little bit before about a false memory test, and I want to just say a few words here about a very popular one, and that's called the DRM paradigm. And that stands for the Dees, Roediger, and McDermott paradigm. Now, I don't have time to go into this in the detail it deserves, but I'm just going to say a few words about the idea behind it, because once you get the idea, it'll help you understand the next few slides that I want to go over. So the DRM paradigm is used to test false memory, and it does this by having word lists and asking people to remember word lists, and then sometime afterwards asking them to recall the word lists. And then they have a look at the types of errors that participants make. So this is an example of a list of words people might be asked to remember. Sour, candy, sugar, bitter, good, taste, tooth, nice, honey, soda, chocolate, heart, cake, and pie. Now, these are indeed all different words, but they've all sort of got something in common, right? There's a common theme amongst them. They could be desserts or candies or sweet things that we like to eat. And when you ask people to recall a list of words like this, what we find is that because these words are in a category, sometimes people make a mistake by adding in something that looks like it could be in the category, but it really wasn't. So the word sweet fits with these words, but it wasn't in the list. And so if you ask people to recall this list of words and you find the word sweet, according to the DRM paradigm, that would be evidence of a false memory. And that's how Clancy and colleagues went about testing people's propensity to be able to succumb to false memories. And so what they were doing in the study then is asking people in each of these groups to complete DRM tests and then just looking to see whether people were making false reports of things that weren't in the word lists. So the DRM results, the Dees-Roediger-McDermott results from the study conducted by Clancy showed this pattern that recovered memory people made the most mistakes in the DRM test, had the most false memories. And that was followed by the group that believed they'd been abducted by aliens but had no memory for that, followed by the control condition. Now all of these groups had an equal amount of correct recall. The only thing that was different was the degree to which these different groups of people introduced false information into their memory recollections. So the researchers concluded that the DRM paradigm and the mistakes people make using that, those mistakes correlate with real-life false memory. So in this study, it has to be a false memory that you're abducted by aliens and you're making more mistakes in the DRM paradigm. So there's a good correlation that those are measuring the same thing. Well, that's the question. So the conclusion here in bold is people who claim repressed and recovered memories are more susceptible to false memory. Now, just going back to the work of Kathy Pezdek, she and colleagues wrote a review article, and I think this is a very, very important article on the topic of false memory. What these researchers did is they had a method of searching for psychology articles that had all been conducted on the topic of false memory. And in their search, right, they discovered false memory research beginning as early as 1994, and they followed that all the way through until 2003. And they would have been looking into their database and using search terms like false memory, and then that would have returned articles which they would have then read and then decided whether this really is going to be part of their review or not. And so of those 198 articles, what we see is that over the years there's been an explosion of research that's been published on the topic of false memory, starting with a few studies, and then in the decade that follows, many, many more studies were conducted. Now, this is all of the studies. You can see that explosion in research. What they also did is they were interested in dividing these studies up into the DRM studies and studies that had looked at false memory for entirely new events. And what this article tells us is that the explosion in false memory research is largely done using the DRM paradigm. And so most of what we know about false memory has come from studies using those word lists. And it is important for you to give some thought as to the appropriateness of a paradigm like that for looking at false memory. And there is indeed quite a bit of critical discussion about that within the false memory literature. But Pezdek and Lam anyway thought that it was pretty bad science to just assume that they were measuring the same thing. So on the one hand, we've got memory for word lists, so that's like your memory for remembering a shopping list, and then people want to extrapolate that to our understanding of false memory. And the understanding lots of people have about false memory is that it is a full-blown memory of something that happened that is entirely false, right? The DRM lists are argued to be largely correct memories with a few mistakes in them. So is that the same thing? I just want to make a couple of comments about the relevance of this research to investigative interviewing. It is really, really important if investigative interviewers are involved in cases involving recovered memories, especially about a child abuse, to seek the advice and help of memory experts and psychologists. While investigating cases that have features of historic allegations and recovered and repressed memories, it's important to be critical about that investigation. Are they actually having a real memory? Is it something that they believed might have happened to them, or is it something that they can actually remember occurring? And how exactly did those memories come to the light? What was the trigger for those memories? Was there some sort of therapy involved where techniques we know that can facilitate false memory might have been used? So for investigative interviewing, it's always going to be the bottom line that we have to be mindful that memory can trick us, right? We have to be mindful that some claims that are made by alleged victims and witnesses are going to be false. Now, with this research being published over the years, there's lots and lots of research being published on false memory. What the effect of that was at a societal level was there was a big backlash against the idea of false memory. People formed support groups. In the United Kingdom, the False Memory Society was started in 1992, and there are other large organisations around the world that offer help to people who are claiming they are victims of allegations that are based on false memory. So what that can do to a society is make people really skeptical about anything that people say happened a long time ago. And so you can imagine if someone came forward and said, look, I just want to report abuse that happened in my childhood. I'm 50 years old now. This happened when I was 5 years old. You can see how a reaction to statements like that would be, how do you know that that's true? You're having a false memory. And that would be quite discouraging, I think, for people to be told that. So given that we know about the reality of false memory, does that mean that all historical cases are likely to involve false memory? And the answer to that question is no. And this is an example here that illustrates the scale of the issues we face. This is a chap called Jimmy Savile, who was a British entertainer who died. The first I saw of this chap was when I saw his face on TV when there was announcements made that he had passed away. In the days and weeks that followed, many people that had come in contact with this man came forward to make claims that he had sexually abused them. And what we can see in this graph, and this is taken from the BBC website, is the numbers of people that came forward alleging abuse for each year. And so we can see here in the 90s and in the 1970s, the offending really peaked. And the locations that these people say the offending occurred were hospitals, an infirmary, schools. These are the locations children should be safe in. Now, there's a really high probability that the people coming forward alleging this type of abuse, wouldn't have really known each other, and we can be very certain that this guy was a very dangerous offender, just given the number of people who have come forward with very similar types of allegations. And I think people who have been abused um, will feel like this false memory idea is a bit of a slap in the face, because it's important to remember that what we've learned over the years is that abuse in the past has been incredibly widespread, and there are lots of reasons why people at the time would not come forward and report abuse. And those reasons can range from just being afraid to do that, or having no one to talk to, no procedures being in place, and so forth. Here's some recommended readings. I would recommend looking at the work of Beth Loftus, James Ost, and Kathy Pezdek. It would be a great starting point if you wanted to look at some of the paradigms that have been used to study recovered, repressed false memory. And a book here I would also recommend is by Chuck Brainerd and Valerie Reyna. They wrote this excellent work called The Science of False Memory, and they go through in excellent detail the vast body of research conducted on the topic. Of course, you would also be advised to look at the work of Beth Loftus. This book here, The Myth of Repressed Memories, is very intriguing, and it's based on the professional experiences and the work that Beth Loftus and colleagues have done on the topic of repressed memory. I would also recommend books like this, No Crueler Tyranny, and this is by an investigative journalist called Dorothy Robanowitz. And when you start reading books with this sort of scope, what you start to understand is the huge repercussions and implications that have occurred in people's lives when they've fallen into the world of recovered and repressed memories, either as someone who has been falsely accused or someone who has been manipulated by therapists to produce these false claims. And she does document some, terrible miscarriages of justice, and also just the terrible things that have happened to people's lives. Thank you.